God of heaven and earth, and build a house that was built these many years ago, which a great king of Israel builded and set up. But after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven into wrath. He gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same king Cyrus, made a decree to build this house of God. And the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, and brought them into the temple of Babylon, those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And he said unto him, Take these vessels, go carry them into the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be builded in his place. Then came the same Sheshbazzar and laid the foundation of the house of God which is in Jerusalem. And since that time even until now hath it been in building, and yet it is not finished. Now therefore, if it seemeth good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house which is there at Babylon, whether it be so, that a decree was made of Cyrus the king to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. Let's bow for prayer. Father, thank you that you are at work in the lives of men, and that you care about the problems that we are facing and the difficulties that we are enduring. Thank you that you, even though it seems like sometimes this world is spinning out of control, you are still using people to accomplish your will. And I trust that as we look through this passage, we will see that you are always in control. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This is interesting because one chapter ago we have a letter that is being sent to the king, and in a little bit I'm going to show you some contrasts and some differences in what's going on between the previous letter and this letter. But here they are again. It seems like every single time they start building and trying to accomplish something, then something happens to take its place. I want you to see, first of all, the timing that's going on here. Every time revival springs up, Satan is going to spring up resistance. You can just count on it. I've told you, every time we get ready to do vacation Bible school, every time we send kids to camp, we need to be praying, we need to be ready, we need to anticipate that there are going to be problems because he just does not want something godly to happen. And it's interesting that he starts off verse 3 here and he says, at the same time. These folks pick up their tools and they finally get back to building what, quite a lot of time has passed here. They wasted a ton of time. They laid the foundation, and now that foundation has been laying there. They were told to stop building. As far as we know, the Bible doesn't record that they made any efforts to contact the king previous to this and say, wait a second, Cyrus told us to do that. They were just okay with sitting there doing nothing. And then God raises up some prophets who challenge them, and they realize, wait a minute, we're not doing what we ought to be doing. And so they make things right spiritually, and then they get to work. And no sooner do they get to work than all of a sudden, here comes these officials. Now, I want you to realize something. He came to them, right? Do you see what it says? At the same time, came to them. You say, what is the big deal about that? Well, a lot of folks argue about this tagline. These officials are all new to us, and we're only a chapter and a half from the other officials in the other letter. And so there's obviously a change in leadership that's gone on. And so you have Darius as king, Artaxerxes is dead. Okay? And all the scenario in Persia is changing a little bit. Now you have this Tatnia, and it says, this side of the river. Usually when the term that's used here for river it is used, it's implying the Euphrates, even though it doesn't say that. But some people think that they're talking about the Jordan River and that this is a Samaritan governor. Now, you remember the enmity between the Samaritans and the Jews. My personal opinion is when I read this, I don't see anything in Scripture that tells me that this is as local as Samaritan because they're talking about the Jordan River. I don't see any reason why we interpret this any different than we interpret anything else where the river is probably the Euphrates River. So Tatnai is probably some regional authority, okay? And I don't know who Sheesh is, but Shehab Bonez, he is another authority figure here, and a little while later we're going to be introduced to a group of individuals. The reason I say all that is to say this. He starts out with this whole thing and he says, at the same time came he to them. If this is a regional person, now there's the possibility that he was going through the area and he was checking on stuff because he needs to report to the king. But more likely, that means somebody was always watching them and somebody was always paying attention. And as soon as they started rebuilding, then whoever was watching and paid attention wasted no time at all in getting to the closest official that they could find that had some kind of authority, and they tried to stop it. Always. The enemy never has good intentions. We talked about that this morning. Job. Satan does his utmost. And when God changes the limit, he goes smack up against that limit. He is going to do the utmost that he can do in someone's life. Be not deceived. He is not your friend. He is walking as a roaring lion. Why? Because he's seeking whom he may. Does that sound like a nice term? Does that sound like he is going to give you the benefit of the doubt? No. And here's a situation where these folks, revival is starting in the land, and they realize that it's important for them to go back and to get busy rebuilding the temple. And no sooner do they start than instantly opposition rises up because they've been standing there waiting to make sure. And when it happens again, they're on it. They are on it, like right now. But I want you to see something really interesting as we look through the rest of this. Darius is a lot different than Artaxerxes, and this isn't the same Darius that we saw in Daniel. This is a different one. You have these companions, and they're going to write a letter to him. And here comes this time of testing. Okay? When they come up to them, what do they say? Number one, who commanded you to build? And number two, who's responsible for it? We want the names of the people who are responsible for this. Let's deal with the first question. Who commanded you to build this at the end of verse 3? In other words, what he's saying is, by whose authority? Now, I have a question for you. Did they have a lockdown answer for that? Yeah, they do. I mean, they actually have paperwork. So, if you have a legitimate reason for being there building, can we rewind one chapter? And when Artaxerxes sends back and says, man, these people have been in rebellion, and these people have been, and these people have been, and you go up there and you tell them to stop, how come nobody sent to Artaxerxes and says, that's illegal? Cyrus the king commanded us to do this. Artaxerxes would have searched through the scrolls and found a whole different thing than what the previous letter asked him to look for. Right? Why has all this time passed before they get around to doing what is right? By whose authority are you doing this? Now, I do want to show you something else that is very interesting here, because look at the last phrase in verse 3. It says, who hath commanded you to build this house, and what? Were they making up the wall? Again, we have with the rebuilding Jerusalem. But remember, this is a whole new administration. And so I was sitting here thinking a little bit yesterday, why is it that they jumped to the conclusion that they would be rebuilding the wall when they're obviously rebuilding the temple? But think about it. He uses some words a little bit later. He says, these great stones and this great timber. They've got a massive building project going on. And so when this guy rolls up on the scene, he just jumps to the conclusion, if they're rebuilding the temple that was torn down, they're rebuilding everything that was torn down, which includes the wall also. What is the purpose of rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the wall? Why do you have this construction going on? What are your intentions? And if you didn't know any better, if you didn't know much about Jewish history, and you rolled up and you saw them building this temple, how would you know that it's a temple? You've seen pictures of it, right? There are massive stones that make up the temple. Huge timbers that make up the temple. How does he know that they're not building a fortress? All he knows is that they have some really big construction going on, and he's kind of responsible for this. So he wants to know under whose authority did you do this? And I want to know who's in charge, because I'm going to send those names on to the king and make sure it's okay with him. There are some concerns here that come up. Look at the end of verse 5. Till the matter come to Darius, and then they returned answer by letter concerning this matter. Okay? That's a problem. That means they're being taken to court. Look at the middle one. It says that they could not cause them to cease. That means they tried to stop them. But legally they couldn't, because they didn't have a reason to legally stop them from building. But can you imagine the frustration and the concern? Because here you have this Persian authority figure who has been set up under Darius, and he shows up at Jerusalem, and he's asking, and you have to be thinking back 10 years to when this happened, in the last letter that went out and the trouble that they got in, and he's wanting to write names down. Can you imagine if you're in charge of that, and you're submitting your name, and it's getting sent way, way, way across the world, if you will, to Darius, and he's going to make a decision about you? There are obviously some concerns that are associated. But I want you to see the hand of God at work. Because let's look at this transmission that goes all the way to Darius. There's a big difference between the letter that goes to Darius this time and the letter that went to Artaxerxes the first time. Starting in verse 6, notice that there's a different tone. The copy of the letter that Tatnai, the governor on this side of the river, and Shethar-bozanan, and the companions, and these guys right here, I looked it up to see who they were. This is an Assyrian tribe. And that's why some people think that this guy was a Samaritan ruler. Instead of talking about the Euphrates River, they're talking about the Jordan River. Under the Assyrian captivity, they took a lot of people out of the region of Samaria and hauled them off, and then they brought a lot of their other folks in, and they put them in that area. And because of this association right here, there are some folks that think that Tatnai was probably from that area and familiar with these folks. But what I want you to notice is, remember the last letter? They started naming off everybody they could name, didn't they? On behalf of this guy and this guy and this group and this group and this group, and if you looked them all up, remember? We said it'd be like writing to the president and saying Tarpon's upset, and Sandlick's upset, and Birchleaf is upset. Can you imagine the president getting out a map and trying to find those places? Well, why are these people so upset? What's the big danger? He doesn't do that this time. He doesn't make it sound like the entire region is in an uproar and the king's going to have to come riding in with the army if something doesn't happen. He just simply says, listen, several of your officials went down there and we are concerned about this situation, and here is exactly what is going on. Now, it's a little bit interesting the way he words this, because he makes it sound like they were in Judea and they noticed. But remember verse 3, that's not what happened, is it? So he lies a little bit. It's not that we heard and we went to stop it. It's that it's not, he sends to the king, and it's almost like he's saying, we're not trying to stir up trouble, but this seemed important and we thought you ought to know. But notice something else about the letter. Look at the observations that he sends to the king instead of the accusations that he sends to the king. Remember the last time when they write to Artaxerxes, they say, you need to research in history and you need to see that this is a rebellious people. And you need to see that if they build up that wall, they're not going to be sending money to you. You need to look up the history of Jerusalem and see how bad these people were in the past. But Tatnai here, he doesn't do that. He doesn't send to Darius and try to influence his decision to look for the bad things about the kings of Israel or the bad things about Jerusalem and the problems that they had in the past. He simply is going down through here, and he is saying, it's my job to report this difficulty to you, and there are some things that you need to know. And he tells them, we stopped by, and we asked him these two questions. Who commanded you to do that? Now, notice in verse 13, that he actually gives an answer to the king, right? We said that if Artaxerxes was to Google Jerusalem and Judea based on what those fellows sent to him the first time, there's not too much good that's coming up about the Jews or Jerusalem or Judea. But if Darius is going to go and Google, and they're told, well, Cyrus allowed them to, and Sheshbazzar was put in charge of, if you start Googling those names, you're going to find out that there were Jewish people like Daniel who were in really high positions of authority and were trusted by these kings. And if they start Googling what this guy sent out and they start looking for information in the library, which is what they're going to ask him to do, they're going to start finding out a whole different scenario than what the first guy asked them to. God is at work here in politics, even though it doesn't seem like it. He tells them this is a government-approved project. And the proof is, they say that Nebuchadnezzar came, and he took the gold and the silver from the temple, and he took it back to Babylon, and he put it in the temple. But when Cyrus sent us back here, he took all that stuff out of the temple that was in Babylon, and he gave it to us to bring us back here. Now, if you're attacking and you're getting ready to write the President of the United States and ask him about this thing, what for sure would you check on? I'd check to see if the gold and silver are there for the temple, wouldn't you? And so he goes down to somebody's house, wherever they're storing it, you got all this treasure, and you're sitting there thinking, well, there has to be some truth to what they're saying because they've got the treasure. That ought to be something easy for Darius to find if that's what he's looking for. And so you have not only a different tone, but you have these different details that are coming out. There are important people that were associated with this. Notice that in the history that we read, he talks about the king that built this temple. Listen, if you wanted to Google the temple at Jerusalem, whose name's coming up? Solomon. Can I just suggest that the whole world knew about Solomon? And they knew about Solomon in a good light. He was known to be a very wise king. He was known to be a wealthy king. He was known to be a powerful king. I mean, Israel's boundary was never as broad as it was in the days of Solomon. And so, can you imagine Darius going to the libraries and looking up and saying, oh, this is the temple that Solomon built. Well, yeah, there's probably paragraph after paragraph about Solomon and Jerusalem and the temple. And I don't think any of it was in a bad light. People used to come from all over the world to meet Solomon. I would imagine people from all over the world toured the outside of the temple. It was a masterpiece. He told them, hey, why don't you look up Sheshbazzar and see? I mean, Cyrus appointed him governor. Not, you better be careful about these Jews, like what happened the last time. There are rebellious people, there are troublesome people, and by the way, those Jews that you sent back to us are causing trouble over here. There's none of that in this letter. He's saying, why don't you Google Sheshbazzar and see? Because he was a trusted individual. And while you're looking him up, you'll probably find Daniel, who served all those kings. You might even find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And by the way, they did a little name dropping and saying, Nebuchadnezzar came. You can't be Babylonian. You can't be a Mede and a Persian without knowing the history of Nebuchadnezzar. What an incredible, incredible kingdom. Riches and all. And he's saying, he came in here and destroyed this. But there's a different focus that goes on here. See, he says who, what, when, where. And notice also he says it was started but never finished. There's no mention of why they stopped. There's no mention of Artaxerxes or the other opposition. He just says they started it and they never finished it. And now they're working on finishing it. Look at verse 17. Different request. Different request here. Now there, if it seemed good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house, which is here at Babylon, there at Babylon, whether it be so that a decree was made of Cyrus, the king, to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning this matter. It's not about the rebellious people. It's not about a dangerous city. It's not about there's going to be much hurt to the king. He simply says, listen, why don't you go and check the history books and see if Cyrus actually did this or not? Because if Cyrus actually did this, the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. So before we put a stop to this and before we raise a ruckus, we better make sure this is legal. Check to see if they are right. Check to see if they are telling the truth. There is not the presupposition that there's evil going on here. There's something else that I want you to see. I want you to see the triumph. Go back to verse 5. But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease till the matter came to Darius. And then they returned to answer by letter concerning this matter. They realized that even in the time of difficulty, and they realized that even in the time of opposition, God was still at work. They're trying to build a temple, and it's been a long time in coming, and they've really been through the ringer on this one, trying to get this done. And some of the folks who came back are probably passed away and still haven't seen the temple built. Can you imagine how discouraging it would be? Remember the sight when they came back and they first started to lay the foundation? The joy and the celebration and the excitement that was going on? How many of those people have died now, and the only thing they've ever seen is what they saw all those years ago when the temple foundation was laid? And it seems like, where's God in all of this? Well, I tell you, God was busy raising up prophets to challenge them that they needed to look at their heart and get some things right. And as soon as they got some things right, they realized, we need to get back and get building a temple. That's the reason he sent us back here in the first place. And so they got busy doing what they were supposed to do. You can expect that there's going to be opposition every time you try to accomplish something good for God. Please understand that Satan is not any bigger than God is, and he can't stop it if God doesn't allow it. And so here in the midst of all this trouble, you have God still at work. And he is still working in the tough times. The next thing I want you to see is the work continued. Remember last time? I mean, they went up and they made them stop. But why didn't somebody bring up that Cyrus gave them written permission to do so? Why didn't they? Years have passed and nobody has sent a messenger to the king. Nobody has tried to do anything. They just simply were content in giving up. And this time, God's working in their hearts. And so even though there might be trouble, and although they might get a letter from the king, and although they might be told to stop building again, until they're told to stop building, the work is going quickly. In fact, isn't that one of the observations that Tatnea sends to Darius? The work prospereth. That's because when you're trying to accomplish something for God, even if there's resistance, God blesses it and he makes it to prosper. So yes, they're having their difficulties, but that doesn't stop the work from prospering. Third thing I want you to see about the triumph, they have a much better relationship with the government officials. You don't have the accusations about these filthy Jews, and you don't have these troublemakers, and you don't have this, you need to be careful or there's going to be hurt to the king. You have a gentleman who shows up and he notices the building that's going on, and he asks some simple, direct questions, which he, as an authority of the Persian government, has a right to ask. Who told you you could do this? And who's in charge? And then he doesn't write a harsh letter accusing them of anything. He simply gives the details, and he gives them the history that they gave to them, and he sends it on to Darius. And the last thing I want you to see is a solid testimony with Darius. Now, Artaxerxes is probably during the time of Esther. Okay? Jews didn't have a great name until Esther comes along. In fact, you have the whole situation with Mordecai and everybody, and they're going to try and wipe out the Jews. And the king's going to allow it, right? Until all of a sudden Esther shows up and reveals the fact that she's one of them and she would be killed also. He's clueless, and he really doesn't care. So you want to kill some Jews? Fine. What does that have to do with me? They don't really belong here anyway. Good old Nebi brought them back. We should have kicked them out a long time ago. And you have all kinds of government officials. Remember how they fought with Daniel and they were jealous of his authority? I am sure that continued even to this day. It always does. So while there wasn't a fantastic testimony going on with Artaxerxes as he's over there dealing with the government in that part, now you have Darius, and he's going to start Googling stuff. Tanya says to him, why don't you go down to the king's library and you start opening the scrolls? And he's going to learn about Solomon. And he's going to learn about Jerusalem. And he's going to learn about all these different things. But one of the things that you cannot help but learn is all the way through this letter, I want you to see that instead of the Jews being the focus, or instead of the government being the focus, who is the focus of this letter? God is. See, when the officials were explaining themselves, and as he writes this letter to Darius, look at verse 8. Be it known unto the king that we went into the province of Judah to the house of the great, what? The great God. And he tells them, Nebuchadnezzar took them captivity, right? So while he is researching Nebuchadnezzar, what's he going to find? He's going to find all that time we spent in Daniel, God dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to see that he took Nebuchadnezzar off the throne, and a relative takes the throne. And then a couple of years later, he restores him to the throne. Folks, can I tell you that that's unheard of in history? It just doesn't normally happen. And Darius is going to be researching all of this. Not from the standpoint that the Jews are a horrible people, but that they have been given permission by one of their own to rebuild this temple to the great God. How great a God is he? I would imagine that by the time Nebuchadnezzar reached the end of his life, you remember some of the phrases that he used in talking about God, don't you? When I came to myself, and I realized that the God of heaven, all this is going to come to Darius. Daniel is going to come up because Daniel served him. And as he's reading through the scrolls and as he's looking, he's going to hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego getting chucked in the fiery furnace. And he's going to realize that they thought they had this great God that they were worshiping out there in the plain. But another God came in and stole the show. He's going to see the written testament in a wicked, heathen country. He's going to read about Cyrus and how Cyrus was moved of God, not only to allow them to go back, to give them permission, to give them letters to get building material, and to give them all of the treasure to take back with them. Who does that? Do you expect Congress at any time soon to start giving back a bunch of money that they took from you? Why? Because it's unnatural. It's unnatural. When does a king take conquered treasure and give it back? But if you're building a house to the great God of Israel, maybe you give the treasure back. He's going to read about Sheshbazzar, who was appointed a governor and who had a job. But when Cyrus makes the decree and allows them to go back. You have Daniel who wants to go back, and he's probably too old to make the journey. Sheshbazzar says, I want to go. And so he is the one that's actually given the treasure and is allowed to take it back to Jerusalem. You have this prominent Jew in a hostile country who has a fantastic testimony and worked closely with Cyrus. That's going to be recorded in the scrolls. And what you're going to see is what the Israelites told Tatniel, who was ignorant. We worshipped God in this temple, but we rebelled against him. And so God used Nebuchadnezzar to come in here, and he hauled a bunch of us off captive. And then later he came back here and he destroyed our temple and he destroyed our walls. But God used Cyrus to allow us to come back. And now God is at work in the building of this temple. Do you see who becomes the center of attention over and over and over again? You may have think Nebuchadnezzar was acting on his own. Tell me, God was doing it. You may have thought Cyrus was acting on his own. I'm telling you, God is doing it. What do you think the response is going to be from Darius when he goes down to the scrolls and he looks all of this up in the library? Do you think he's going to say, no, you can't build a house to a God who delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace, who kept Daniel safe in the lion's den, who preserved him through all these different kings and administrations, who as an old man is still ministering to Cyrus? Who was able to work in Cyrus's heart to send all this back and to allow this to happen. Do you think Darius is going to write back and say, you go up there and tell them people to stop? I think Darius is probably saying, I probably need to know a little bit more about this great God they're worshiping in Jerusalem. And when he sends the letter back, Tatniel is probably thinking, you know what? I probably need to know a little bit more about this great God they're worshiping. Now, they could have gotten attitude with Tatniel when he showed up. They could have just flown off the handle and said, sick and tired of this. Again, you're going to try and stop us? We got permission from Cyrus to do this. Why don't you get your hang down on out of here? They could have. But why ruin your testimony with a government official when you can spend your time promoting what a wonderful God we serve? And that's the beauty of this chapter. Because God is at work in history. He is at work in people. He is at work in politics. And sometimes we don't like it, but he's working nonetheless. And he is accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. Are we helping? Or are we hindering? Let's bow forward. Father, sometimes it is so easy for us to get caught up in the affairs of men. And we get so worked up about politics and popular opinion and the cares of life and the day-to-day activities that are going on that we forget that you are and always will be on the throne. And even when you worked through Nebuchadnezzar and humbled him and made him as an animal for years before restoring him again to the throne. Or whether it's in a difficult situation that Daniel finds himself facing the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who went along with the government but refused to compromise when it came to worshiping anyone but you. Father, it starts when we purpose in our hearts, like Daniel did, that we won't defile ourselves. And if we won't defile ourselves, then we worship as we ought. And we act in a way that reflects your nature. And if we do it consistently over and over and over again, when accusation comes, they threw him in the lion's den because they just could not find a single area of life that was faithfulness to you. And if the only thing that folks in our area can beat us over the head with is our faithfulness to you. What a fantastic testimony.